Hi, I'm Mark Jamison. I'm the Director and Gerald Gunter Professor of the Public Utility Research Center and the head of the Digital Markets Initiative at the University of Florida. And I'm also a non-resident senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. I'm here to talk about a paper that a colleague of mine, Tejas Ajit, and I did that's called The Effects of Conferring Business Resources on Rivals. What this is about is this issue of what happens if a government or regulatory institution steps in and requires a technology company, an information technology company, you might think of it as a big tech company, to share the data it has with its rivals. We'd like to be sure to thank up front the Mercatus Center for its support of this research and the putting together people to talk about it. The input from people has been invaluable, and we're very appreciative of what Mercatus has lent to us in terms of its resources. So why is this particularly interesting? Well, you've probably heard people talk about that data is the new oil, as if there's an essential resource that's a limited resource of data. And if you don't have that, you're just out of the economy. You've heard people talk about the big tech kind of controlling data and precluding people from being able to enter different types of technology markets. The UK and a few other countries have stepped up into this space and said, well, what we're going to do is require these companies to share the data they have in some sense. And some of the details of those are still being worked out. Now, this is a perspective that has a long history. If you go back to the 1960s, there were debates over this over railroads, whether or not a track was an essential facility that someone else, another railroad, should be allowed to use. That term essential facility actually came from this application of this same idea in telecommunications in the United States. We won't go into any of the details, but the way it played out is it was decided that the incumbent companies, which had been regulated as public utilities at some points in the past and had been given exclusive franchises in some sense, had to share their facilities with their rivals. The lessons that we learned from those experiences were in the railroads. If this was a practice that was required, sharing of tracks, it kind of discouraged people from building tracks because they didn't get to just keep the profits from the rails themselves. Rivals got to use them and profit from them. In a case of telecommunications, similar things happen. We found that actually the new entrants were hesitant to make their own investments if they could use somebody else's. We also found that they were slow to adopt technology changes because they would build their networks around this old technology that the incumbent telecommunications companies had used. And they were actually they would go to the regulators and say, oh, you can't let these incumbents change technologies because that damages our business. But Tejas and I were curious. We wanted to know, do these same kinds of lessons apply in the case of big tech? Because these were all mature industries at the time these policies were put in place. We thought the technologies were stable, fairly mature as well. That's certainly not the case with big tech. A different set of issues. Innovation is much more important to us in big tech than it is in some of these other industries, at least at the times that those policies were put into place. So we wanted to know what happens to investment. Will the companies that are gathering data invest more or less if they have to share it with someone else? What happens to the incentives to innovate? Will innovation be faster or slower with this type of sharing? And is there some way, some mechanism that could be used that would make this a viable commercial transaction? To skip to the end and just to let you know what we found that, as you might suspect, the incumbent companies, the ones that are there in the markets first, tend to slow down their investments if they know that their rivals are going to be able to benefit from those investments and it becomes a more competitive market. That's not surprising. We also found, perhaps a little bit more surprising, is that the new entrants would typically be the first to jump to a new technology, but if you require sharing, that slows down their incentive to jump to the new technology. We also found that it's really difficult. You can't be imagined, but it's really difficult to come to a commercial arrangement on the data sharing. So let me tell you how we went about figuring this out. Tejas was particularly interested in trying to understand technology adoption in this case, or at least see its implications. So we applied what what is called an S-shaped curve, and you've probably seen these before when people talk about technology adoption. That at first there's a slow adoption till people kind of learn about the technologies. The investments are able to make, so we can take more customers, and then the usage, the adoption accelerates and then starts slowing down, and you get the kind of flattening of the curve at the top. This is a approach, or excuse me, a pattern of adoption that's tended to prove itself over and over and over again in many different types of situations. So why does an S-shaped curve tend to show up? Well, some of the things I just talked about. One is it takes time for information to kind of spread so people are aware of the technology, or at least of the benefits of it, and that it kind of might suit their lives. Of course, there are evolutions of the technologies that occur over time as well. And then people need to learn how to adopt these technologies so they can make it part of their lives. That takes time as well. And then there's also differences in population. Some people are early adopters. They'll take on whatever's new. They're really excited about it. Other people are a little more skeptical. They take some time. Then there's just the cost of supply. The faster you have to deploy a network, the more costly the network becomes. So that drags things out in some sense as well. And you end up with that S-shaped curve. So what we did, this is an economics paper. It gets kind of technical. I'm not going to go through the technical aspects. Let me just describe kind of how we thought about this. So we assume that there's an initial company that launches the technology, launches the service with it, and starts up the S-shaped curve. Eventually, a new entrant comes along. Oh, let me step back and say, okay, so as this incumbent is moving up this S-shaped curve, it is learning, gathering data, studying customers, learning exactly the kinds of things they like, and is receiving its profits from advertising that it sells. So, and then after a while, this new entrant comes in, and we just leave as an option. Does it get to share? Does it get data from the incumbent or not? There's also an S-shaped learning curve for the new entrant. People have to become aware of it, and is it as good as the incumbent company? There's issues of someone who's already adopted technology. Would they really transfer? So there's an S-shaped curve as well, but it eventually catches up. And so almost everybody in the market is aware of this new entrant. So people pretty much know that these two companies are out there. At some point, there's a new technology that becomes available. And we wonder, who's going to adopt this technology? Is it going to be the new entrant? Who's going to adopt it first? The new entrant or the incumbent? Or will they ever adopt it? So that's an issue in our analysis as well. We want to know, will they adopt it and when they will adopt it? So the kinds of things that we find that if there is no data sharing, the new entrant is the one that actually jumps to the new technology first. And the reason is pretty intuitive. It does that because if you start a new technology, you cannibalize the old market. Customers migrate. It has a S-shaped S-shaped adoption curve as well. And so customers are migrating. So that is a loss. If your old customers move to the new technology, you're giving up profits from the old technology. You're getting new ones, but you're giving up the old. Who gives up the most? That's a cost of doing business. And it turns out if the new entrant is smaller because it's not had this data sharing, that it'll leap first because it's just not giving up as much as the incumbent. So it'll move faster and adopt the new technology. So it is more likely to innovate. Well, what happens though if we have the data sharing? Well, now because of the data sharing back in the first market, this new entrant has a bigger market share. So if it adopts the new technology, it gives up profits from its existing customer base. And that's a problem for it. That's a cost for it. So the data sharing actually slows down the innovation of the new entrant. Now you can imagine scenarios where it actually might be the incumbent that jumps first, but you have to make the new entrant actually have a much superior product in the first market in order to get that to happen, which we don't assume. So what we find then is that the new entrant moves first, regardless of whether it's sharing or not, but it moves more slowly if there is data sharing because it is held back by the profits it's making off of the data that the incumbent has given it. So, what then happened? Oh, one other thing I need to explain. So what happened in the first market? If the incumbent knows it is supposed to share the data it gathers, that's whenever a new entrant comes in. If that's the regulatory rule, then what happens is something you might expect. It actually slows down its data collection. It slows down the customers it accumulates, so that S-shaped adoption curve flattens out. And so customers are served less because serving the customers builds up a resource that then you have to give away in some sense to your rival. We've tried to develop a pricing mechanism, a way that you could have a commercially viable sharing. It's possible to calculate it, but it's really hard. It's hard to come up with that particular number. And in the commercial negotiations or in a regulatory environment, chances are we would not be able to get that right. But that's our speculation, as opposed to something we analytically derive. Now, of course, this isn't the end of the story. That's kind of where our paper ends, but there's still a lot more to be talked about. You might ask questions about, well, what about churn? What if there's customers that just kind of change providers? How does that affect things? Well, it will, but that's not been analyzed yet. You might ask about, well, what if there are other companies that enter these markets too? Or what if there's someone that from the outside that enters that new technology and it's not a couple of the companies that are with the old technology? Well, that'll affect results as well. It doesn't affect the two companies we analyze, their incentives, other than it changes how much of the old market they can actually hang on to. And what if there are real quality differences? So we kind of treated these companies as the same. What if they have quality differences? Or what if there are different types of network externalities than we assumed? Well, those all could matter. But the basic ideas will probably still hold, that the more profitable it is to stay with an old technology, the less likely you are to jump to a new one. So the data sharing changes that dynamic, probably does slow down innovation, probably does slow down investment, because anytime you have to incur costs that benefit your rival, you're going to do less of that. And it's always going to be difficult to get the negotiations to work well in any kind of data sharing arrangement. So that's our conclusion. Again, thank you for taking the time to listen. Very grateful to Mercatus Institute, Mercatus Center, for providing us with this support and for making this available. Thank you.